building an indie business in the center of venture capital investment. I'm Alex Edmonds, known as SupremeRumHam on the internet. Welcome to the Building an Indie Business podcast. Okay, that's a new intro that I thought up just now. Tell me what you think about it. This episode is going to be about interviewing, and I thought this was very appropriate because I just interviewed someone. So I'm going to go over the do's of interviewing, the don'ts of interviewing, what else? Yeah, the don'ts of interviewing. I'm going to walk you through a little bit about how to interview someone. I'm going to talk about the mistakes I made. I made a couple. The benefits of interviewing, the downsides of interviewing, what software to use, and how to get great guests. Okay, before we get started, I want to let you guys know that this is the 50th episode, I believe, and my goal was to hit 52. That's my only goal for this, the podcast, 52 episodes. And so now that I'm definitely going to hit that number, I want to hear from you guys because I don't hear a lot of feedback from my listeners. So I created a survey. It's just 10 quick questions. I want to hear how you found out about the podcast. What's your favorite episode? Is there anything you want to hear? Anything missing? Things like that. So I'm going to be putting a link to the survey in the show notes. Okay, so let's get started. The do's of interviewing someone. Assume your audience knows nothing. So when you have a guest on the podcast, introduce your guest, or let them introduce themselves. Let them introduce what they want to talk about or their history. Okay, and you want to do this because your audience can easily get lost or disinterested if you start a podcast or a conversation, in this case, in the middle. Start out light. And this is because your podcast guests might not be used to being on a podcast and they might be nervous. So allowing them to start with easy questions, it'll make them less nervous. And after some easy questions, they will relax. So start off with something about their background, and they'll start from there. Open-ended questions only. So ask them questions that they can expand on, and it won't end abruptly, and it'd be difficult to transition. So an example would be, don't ask, what's your favorite ice cream flavor? Ask, which ice cream flavor do you think is better, chocolate or strawberry, and why? Okay. Next is have a goal. What do you want to get out of the interview? What do you want to know? This allows you to direct where the interview will go, the flow of the interview. So, for example, my goal with Brennan was to learn about finance, and Brennan's goal was to talk about product hunt. And so I will go over in the walkthrough about how I achieved that. Okay, let them know that things can be edited out. And the reason why you want to do this is because it'll make them more comfortable and willing to talk. If they might be afraid to be open with you if they are afraid of making a mistake and thinking that you're going to publish it no matter what. Okay. The next do is be flexible. Don't stick to the script. If the interview goes beyond your outline, let it. In my interview with Brennan, I had 15 questions that I had outlined, and we only went through about 5 of them. Okay. Do avoid questions that might make the guest feel awkward. So, in my interview, I knew that Brendan had just exited his his company that he was a part of. So I didn't ask him like, oh, how much did you make because of the exit? Because that might make him feel awkward. Okay. Do remember that they're most likely doing you a favor. And the reason why I bring this up is because you don't want to blindside them with one of your questions. So one example would be that I wouldn't be like, how do you feel about venture capital and the impact it's having on the lower class in New York? I wouldn't say that to Brendan because that's awkward and he has nothing to do with that. Okay. The next thing to do is give them the first question ahead of time. So the reason you want to do this is because it helps the podcast flow, because the person is already thinking about what to say before the podcast gets started, and they don't have to stop and then they don't have to. There's not an awkward pause right after you ask the first question because they already know what they're going to say. So with Brendan, he knew before we started recording that I was going to ask him about University Beyond. Okay. So the next thing you should do is your research. Don't ask questions they've answered a million times. With my research with Brendan, I knew he has a background in finance. I knew he was involved in a esports startup. He's a big fan of Product Hunt podcasts because he's a part of the open podcast community. And he lives in New York. So I don't have a bad example of not doing your research for Brendan, but I listened to a lot of Bill Burr interviews, and one thing you don't want to ask Bill is don't ask him how he got started in stand-up. He's answered that question a million times. Don't ask him about why he started his podcast because he's answered that question a million times, and he's answered that recently. So if you're doing your research on Bill, and you look through his videos and previous interviews, you'll see that he's answered that multiple times. It's bad. Okay. The final thing that you want to do is make sure to allow your guests to mention anything you may have missed. And you want to do this by saying, is there anything else that you would like to mention? Okay. Those are the do's of interviewing someone. Now, these are the don'ts. Don't do rapid fire questions. They're lazy. You don't have to do research for them. And your podcast ends up sounding the same because each guest their answers will eventually mix and be the same. Okay. Don't express your opinion or comment on something that the person you're interviewing says. It eats up time and no one cares what you have to say. If you're interviewing Bill Burr and you express your opinion about something he says, I don't care. I'm listening to the interview for what Bill has to say. If you want to say something about what he said, do an episode after the interview, a solo episode, explaining your thoughts through the interview. No one cares. Alright, don't jump right into the interview. Meet with them before, let them relax, and then start recording. So, with Brendan, I spent about an hour with him before the podcast, even longer than that. And we just really got to know each other. We talked about the what questions to ask, things like that, and it really helped us have a better interview. Alright, so interview walkthrough. So for an interview, what you want to do is you want to have 12 to 15 questions, so half a page of questions for 30 minutes of an interview. And so if you have an hour interview, you want a full page of questions. And this is so you don't get stumped or have any dead air during the interview. Okay, and so you also want to map out the interview, creating a web of potential answers, so that way you know what to ask if the guest goes a certain way. So, for example, if you ask, or hold on, let me just do my example. So, I was going to ask Brennan about his previous startup, and then I was going to ask about his role at the startup. And then, depending on what he said about his role, I was going to ask about finance or about his day-to-day at the company. So if he said, "Oh, I was the CFO of the company," I was going to ask the finance question. And if he said, "Oh, I was the CTO," I was going to ask, "What is your day-to-day like?" Okay. So you want to do that and try to transition to each question. So actually, let me just go over the full interview that I had out in my head. So I was going to start out with tell us about yourself. Then I was going to go to previous startup. Then I was going to go to role at the company. And if he answered about finance, I was going to say advantages for a company to stay private longer. And then I was going to ask about the indie maker movement, which is how I met him online. And then I was going to ask about Product Hunt. And then I was going to ask about the Product Hunt meetup that he has just hosted. And then I was going to say, what are you working on now? And so if he answered about like the CTO or a different role, I was going to say, what's your day-to-day? What attracted you to bootstrapping? Then I was going to go to Product Hunt. And I was going to go to the meetup. I was going to let him talk about the meetup. And then we were going to meet up at what are you working on now? And then I was going to ask him about the podcast industry. Some of these questions I didn't even get to because I just let him go. I let him talk about his previous startup, about college, about his opinion about the education industry. We didn't even, like I said, we only went through like 5 questions that I had. I was prepared for a switch, as you always should be. Okay. The mistakes I made during the podcast, or during the interview. I interrupted him by accident. And, so he was talking, and I said, "Oh, what year was this in?" to get a better frame of mind for people, especially for me. And so I interrupted him by accident, and I think I ruined his train of thought, and that kind of slowed down the interview a bit. Another mistake is I transitioned badly. He was finished making his point, and I go, "Oh, is that it?" And so for what I meant was, "Are you done with the interview?" And I felt like that was like, "Oh, I'm bored. Are you done with what you're talking about?" Yeah, I didn't think that came off well. The final thing that I did badly, and I think that I did this really badly, is I didn't test the audio or software for the interview. So I had just assumed that if we were on any video platform, that it would record the audio for me, and I could just edit it somewhere, or on Audacity, because that's how I do things. Okay, but we tried Zoom. It wouldn't record the audio. It would record the video, but not just solely the audio, the video, the audio. It wouldn't record the audio only. And so we tried Google Hangouts. That didn't work either. We tried Skype. That didn't work either. And finally, Brendan was like, "Oh, is there like a podcasting interview software?" And I was like, "Yeah, let's try Zencastr," which I know about, but I just wasn't thinking about it. So finally, we did Zencastr for the audio, and then Skype for the video. And we got disconnected after the interview, and we saw the video, but because the audio was on Zencastr, we couldn't hear each other, and so we had to hang up on Skype and then call each other back. And I just thought that was really funny. Okay, now the benefits of interviewing. When you've interviewed someone who doesn't have a podcast and they have an interest in podcasting, they'll invite you onto their new podcast, and you'll be exposed to a new audience, and so will your podcast, so you'll get more listeners. Okay. Another benefit is less speaking for the host. So I've been talking for 15 minutes nonstop, and with interviewing someone, I talked about, when I was interviewing Brennan, I talked about for maybe 2 minutes total in a 46-minute podcast. That was great. I loved it. Okay. The downsides of interviewing someone. You constantly have to search for guests. I was very lucky that Brendan had asked Fajar or me to interview him. I probably wouldn't have done an interview if it wasn't for him, because I don't want to search for guests, and that's why my podcast is solo. Okay. Another downside of interviewing is the inconsistency in the quality of your guests. So one person can have experience being on a podcast, and that really helps you because they know how to handle being on a podcast and they might not get nervous. Another guest you have, this might be their first podcast and they're not used to expressing themselves, and so they'll be nervous, and your quality between interviews will be inconsistent. Okay, so now how to interview someone, specifically the software to use. So to record the actual interview, I use Zencastr, and what Zencastr does is it will send you 2 audio files. It'll send you your audio and your guest's audio. The downside of Zencastr is you can only have 2 people on the interview, so if you want to do a round table, you can't use Zencastr for that. We use Skype for video, and that's just to see each other, and if you want to make visual cues to each other. And then for editing, you can use Audacity. So like I said, Zencastr will give you 2 audio files, and you upload them or import them to Audacity, and then you do like 3 different things. I think you go to track and then mix and then render, and then it'll put them together. It's very easy. I was so relieved it was so easy. Okay. The next and final thing I want to talk about is how to get great guests on your podcast. Okay. The first thing you want to do is you want to tap into your network. And this is how I had Brennan as a guest on the podcast. He is part of the Open Podcast Network. He was looking for to be interviewed, and I was looking for someone in the community to help start the Open Podcast community podcast. And I finally did, and I will put it in the show notes, finally. Okay. The next thing you want to do to find great guests is look for places where people are looking for guests. So there's podguest.me, which has basically ads for people that want to be guests on podcasts. It lists what their area of expertise is, why they want to be on podcasts, stuff like that. So that is one place. And I actually am currently working on a feature to post ads for people that want to be guests on podcasts and people that are looking for a co-host. That will be a paid feature though, but it'll be like $1 to $2 just so I don't have to have fees, and it'll prevent spam on that page. Okay, so the next thing you can do to get great guests, and I think this is the final point I'm making. Yeah, so the final way to get great guests is have a specific person in mind and find out where to contact them and reach out to them from there. So let's say I wanted to have Bill Burr on the podcast, which I would love that. But anyways, so if I wanted to have Bill on the podcast, I couldn't reach him on social media because he has 1.4 million followers, something like that. So he's always saying, email me at bill@themmmpodcast.com, and his assistant goes through that. So odds are he would hear about that I wanted to interview him on my podcast if I sent him the email. So probably email would be best for him. So yeah, that's how you would get great guests. Okay, that's all I have for today. This is a pretty long episode. Thank you for listening. Have a nice day. If you are an avid listener of the podcast, please fill out the survey. It'll be in the show notes. Thank you for listening again. Have a nice day.